Times were hard when I were a lad. If we wanted to paint our figures, all we had were mud and an old toothbrush. But in the 21st century, everything's bright and colourful. We've got airbrushes, we've got acrylics, we've got speed paints, we've got contrast paints, and we've got something called wet palettes. What are they, I hear you ask? Well, let's find out. Hello and thanks for joining me on Dragon's Teeth. Yes, today we're looking at wet palettes. Now, this is something else that's new to me, coming back into the hobby. It wasn't quite as bad as that back in the day, but I do remember using Humbrol paints, which were like enamels on my old Airfix kits, and then you had to use thinner. You had to clean your brushes in thinner, which really stank and everything else. And from what I remember, well, it's probably partly my technique at the time as well, but enamels were not that great. They were great for solid colour, but mixing paints and that kind of stuff wasn't really a thing that you did very much. So when I got back into the hobby, or at least the modelling side of it, building kits and making dioramas, I started using acrylic paints, mostly Tamiya at the time, because I was making armour and planes and that kind of thing, but also branched out into some other acrylic paints, particularly when I was painting like 75mm, 54mm figures, that kind of stuff. So that was great to an extent. When I started using my airbrush, for example, those paints worked well enough. I think back in the day I got a Badger airbrush at one point, probably in the late 70s or something, and that was a fairly crude design. A few years back, I think it's an Iwata, I can't remember the name of the model airbrush, and that works really well. In fact, one day I'll do something on using the airbrush as well, a very useful tool. But anyway, that was using acrylic paints. So when I got back into gaming, I've still got a load of those acrylic paints. I thought they'll be perfect to paint my figures. Well, yes and no. Because here's the problem, as I'm sure you all know with acrylic paints, I use something like this, just a palette. Now, with the Tamiya paints, you tend to use those straight out of the jar. Well, what usually happens is you give them a good shake, then you get a cocktail stick or something and you give them a good stir, and you sort of get all that gloop at the bottom. You get a bit of that out, and then you're normally working off of that. I find if they've been sitting for a while, you really got to give them a good shake and stir to get a decent consistency. Now, if you're painting armour or terrain or something like that, it's fine. If you're getting into things like figures, 25mm, especially 10mm, then we need something that gives us a bit more control of our paint flow. So that's the first thing. But if you're using something like this, now with the sort of dropper bottles, I squeeze a bit out and I've got maybe 10 minutes most to use that paint before it really starts drying up. So you add your water, you add your thinner or whatever, of course, but even with that, you've got to work pretty quick to get your paint down before that dries up. And the other thing I found with the newer paints, I got some Army Painter sets, a D&D set in particular. They're much nicer to work with, they're much easier to mix, and they give you a much nicer flow on the figure if you've got the right thing to put them on. So I did a bit of investigation and I learnt about these things called wet palettes. Of course, this is all new to me. A bit like the slap chop I did on my zombies on the last fantasy upload, but I thought I'd give it a try. Now, you can buy wet palettes now. I think Army Painters have one. There's a couple of others coming out on Kickstart. There's one in the States that looks really nice, that comes with a nice lot of accessories, but I'm not sure if that's available in the UK yet. Anyway, you can buy them for between sort of 20-30 quid, which isn't too bad really. Or you can have a go at making your own for, well, pretty much about a fiver. So if you want to save a bit of money, then this is the way to do it. For me, I'm going to do this because, you know, I'm all spent out at the moment. As you know, if you've been watching the channel, I've been buying so much stuff lately. So I'm trying to save a bit of money. I'm going to make my own, but also this will give me a chance to get used to using a wet palette before and if I decide to splash out on a proper one. So let's make a start. What a wet palette does, as the name implies, is keeps our paint on the palette wet. Further than that, if you make these up properly, you can seal your container and your paint will stay wet for, well, some amount of time. That's something I'm going to experiment with. But by all accounts, with a good wet palette, you can come back days later and your paint will still be ready to use. So we need just a few things, and as I say, you can make these very cheap. This is £3 for a couple of plastic containers, and I've got the ones with the clip locks, as you'll see why in a moment, because I can either use the container part as my palette to hold my palette, or I can potentially use the lid as well. And then with the clip locks, it makes it easy. I just put that on there and I clip shut. What I'm going to try today is I'm going to just use the container part to keep things quick and simple. Some people say that when you've got your brush, the edge of your container can get in the way a little bit. Well, what I might do actually is do one of each. I'll use the container for this and the lid for this one perhaps. Because these are quite small, I don't anticipate getting a huge number of paint colours in there. So having said that, how many paint colours am I going to be using at one time? Still, if I got two, I can do something like all my dark colours here or my light colours here, or whatever, you know, base colours, highlight colours, that kind of thing. What we need then are a few layers. We've got our base layer, which is the container. On top of that, we're going to put a sponge layer. Now you can try using normal kitchen towel, or what I'm going to use are these cleaning cloths, all-purpose cloths that you get from Tesco or B&M. Dare I mention B&M again? These are actually for B&M. I should really look at getting a sponsorship deal. So what I'm going to do here is I've got some folded towel and I'm just going to cut that to the size of my container. Having done that, I'm just going to pop that in. I'm going to I think I'm going to double up on layers there. I did see some people suggest like 10 sheets of kitchen towel. So I think I'm going to put another layer on top of that as well. And I'm putting that across, so I'm cross layering. I'll just trim that off a little more. Now we get onto our membrane layer, what we might actually call the palette surface itself that the paint is going to sit on. So we need something that will allow a bit of water through but not get totally soaking wet. And the best thing to use is something called parchment paper, which I'd never heard of. I immediately thought of baking paper, of course, or that sort of, you know, waxy sort of paper. But apparently they don't do the trick because they're not porous enough. This is just the right amount of porosity, is that even a word, which will allow some of the water to come through but won't get totally waterlogged. And again, this, I just got this in the supermarket, a couple of quid or something like that. And there's quite a long rope, 45 feet, so that's going to last me quite a few wet pallets, I imagine. And it doesn't matter which side you use, both sides are the same. It has the feel of sort of baking paper, but a little thinner perhaps. So I'm just going to cut a piece of this to shape. And then we place that onto our sponge, and again just give that a good press around all the edges, get rid of all the air bubbles, and that, as they say, is that. So this is nicely damp, so the water's coming through there but not too much, I hope. What I'm going to do now is make the other one, because that's only taken like, you know, 5 minutes. So I'll do the other one upside down. As I said, I'll use the lid for that one. And once we've got them both done, I don't really have time to do any painting today because I'm recording a podcast in about an hour or so. But what I will do is put a couple of paint dots on here, just show you how they work, hopefully. And then I'll seal these up and I'll leave them overnight and I'll come back to the painting tomorrow. So that'll be a nice test to see if I've got the right amount of water and everything else in there. All right, so let's make that second one a pink and a blue. How nice. And that's that. 2 wet palettes, one using the container and the other one using the lid. All right, let's get some paint on them. And speaking of the Army Painters D&D set, that's what I'm going to use here. So I'll do red for this one, Vampire Garments. Yeah, we'll put a little drop in there. And for the other one, we'll use a blue. This is Dracolich. Dracolich or Dracolic? Dracolich, I think. Dracolich scales on the lid. Now what you can do as well is just use a dropper, just to put a little drop or two of water in. That gives us something to mix with directly. See, that sits on there quite nicely. And then I can pull off of that to bring into the paint and start to spread it out however thin or thick I want it. And that starts to go on very nicely. And so I haven't really got time to paint anything this afternoon because of my recording, but now I've done that, I shall seal it up and see how that looks tomorrow. Let's just do a little bit of the blue as well. Obviously I'm going to contaminate that with the red, but you know, that gives a chance to see how you can mix colours as well, I guess. And that feels like there's a lot of control there over, you know, the consistency of my paint. See, that's quite a bit thinner where I thin that out more, almost translucent. So I shall try this with my flow agent on the slap chop. I'll redo the slap chop method as well and see how that comes out. Okay, so let's put the lid on that one as well. 2 wet palettes then. Simple, quick, easy to make and very cheap. Music to my ears. So I hope you can join me next time when I'll start actually using these to finish off my 28mm fantasy figures. And the other thing I want to get completed over the holidays is my Age of Sail stuff, my 1/1200th sailing ships. The painting's all done, so the next stage, which will be coming up soon, is the rigging. So do keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, if you haven't already, please do like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you soon.